tools, be it a hammer, a screwdriver. They have many uses, but I think we can agree that using a screwdriver to hammer down a nail is probably the least effective way to hammer a nail. I've been thinking about this as of late. Not the screwdriver thing. I mean the idea of what your toolkit is as an art critic, and what tools are the correct ones for what job. Honestly, there isn't a particularly correct answer. A critique may come out more or less useful depending on what analysis toolkit you use. But I think in particular with critiques of stories, there's a problem in the YouTube community where I feel that we're constantly using the wrong toolset to analyze stories. And this is something I've been guilty of myself too. I think it makes sense to compare video game mechanics in one game with another mechanic in another game, but does that make sense in terms of a story? Or alternatively, does it make sense to analyze what a game might be saying beyond the surface if it's literally just Mario Kart World? I've changed my method for art criticism a lot lately, thinking about stories and such, and honestly I wanted to share my experience and method for analyzing stories, hopefully so we can get better YouTube analyses out there. Allow me to present to you one of the main subjects of today's video, the tool that I like to call checklist criticism.
My point is, in order to know what a game is good at, you have to know what games are capable of. You need a baseline, and the more you play, the more accurate your baseline becomes. I would even say that playing games alone isn't enough. After all, it seems foolish to review a visual novel without ever having read a book. If one were to ask me, I'd say there's a lot more to a good critic than just consuming a bunch of media, but it's a necessary part of the equation.
Checklist criticism is a very interesting method of analysis to discuss, in the sense that while it's a very effective tool to use for many types of analyses, games being a particularly good example of this, I think it comes up short in many areas. Something interesting to note what our friend and game developer Matthew Matosa said here is the fact that video game critics need to be able to draw upon a lifetime of experience in order to be effective critics. And I certainly agree on a baseline level, as he says it's not really effective to review Sekiro as a puzzle game. However, I wanted to use what Mr. Matosa said here as a springboard to deeper analysis. You see, analyzing a game like this works. Analyzing it for what it does well, you compare it to other similar experiences, and come to a conclusion of whether or not it's being effective at what it wants to do. I've used this method of analysis to talk about many games in the past myself. But something I was hoping to point out here, does consuming a bunch of stories seem to you like the best way to criticize a story? Is it really the most effective way to think about it? Reading books, watching movies, playing many narrative-driven games can certainly help you come up with more satisfying answers of what a story might be doing right or wrong in terms of narrative. It can help you identify tropes in storytelling, or inconsistencies, or many things. But something it can't give you is something a little bit more complicated than that. Don't get me wrong, consuming a bunch of media from all around the globe, being exposed to different sorts of cosmovisions, that can be pretty useful for the type of critique I'm trying to point towards. But the problem I'm identifying here is that a purely checklist critic approach can really help you identify what a story might be trying to say beyond the surface level. You can see that the story might have a 3-act structure with hero's journey and all of that, but you can't really identify what the story says about us, about the world the story was conceived in, about what the developers might have possibly been trying to tell with it, or even beyond that, what the story says regardless of developer intention. I think I know the correct toolset for this, or at least a better toolset to analyze these things, but I don't want to fully reveal my cards just yet. However, let's just keep this in the back of our minds, alright? Checklist criticism can be great at analyzing the gameplay of Super Mario Bros., but it's not really useful at telling you what Super Mario Bros. Says and what it says about us that we enjoy it so much. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that, even if not every game tells a story with an intended message, perhaps we can agree that stories sell you on ideas, right? That's not to say that every game that has a story has a secret hidden agenda, but rather that if we decide to look beyond the surface level, we can usually find interesting things that the story might even, if unconsciously, engaging with. People often say that all art is political, but I'm not sure if I agree with that sentiment in the way that people usually mean it. My way of interpreting that all art is political is that all art is made within a political context. There are material conditions and a material history that lead the artist to make a specific kind of game or narrative, and those material conditions can lead to stories saying a lot very interesting political things, even in places that one might not expect. Because something that people don't realize is that a story tells us just as much about itself through what it doesn't ask, as through what it does ask. A pretty good example in my opinion is Sonic the Hedgehog. Let's talk a little bit about what the checklist critic method tells us about Sonic the Hedgehog. Well, in Sonic the Hedgehog 1991, Sonic starts in Green Hill and ends up in Scrap Brain, a polluted city. There's also stuff like Eggman being the representation for humanity, or the fact that he put flickies inside the robots. It's easy. Sonic the Hedgehog is a story about nature versus technology. This is as far as checklist criticism can take us, but what happens if we look a little bit deeper? That reading I just did of Sonic the Hedgehog is also a very surface level reading, is what perhaps you didn't notice. You're evaluating whether Sonic the Hedgehog works on an emotional satisfactory level, but you can't really go beyond that. And crucially, it's just looking what the developers were trying to do, and not what their story actually does. Allow me to propose something. What if Sonic the Hedgehog engages with ideas that it didn't intend to? Eggman is a foreigner to South Island and comes in to essentially enslave the local population, the sentient sapient flickies, by putting them inside his robots. Doesn't that remind you of anything? Perhaps colonial? But this goes a layer deeper. Sonic and Sonic the Hedgehog is a lone hero, but the game never gives the flickies any agency in their fight. Sonic does it all for them. If anything, you could argue the flickies passively let themselves be captured and don't resist. Isn't that saying something about the way we view liberation? That we need a befallen hero to come save us? Perhaps the story itself reflects somewhat the world around us more than we're willing to admit. There are many methods of analyzing stories, structuralism being another one for example. What I just did there is a dialectic materialist method of story analysis. Not just looking at whether the story ticks specific boxes of a basic storytelling thing, but analyzing what the story says beyond the surface. But I hope we can understand one thing. Checklist criticism sometimes isn't enough. Have you ever thought how this applies to more narrative-heavy games? Maybe in communities of games like those, stories are actually analyzed the way I'm advocating for. But the answer is that, unfortunately, that's not really the case. Ace Attorney is one of my favorite series, I love it, even despite its very bad political messaging I've detailed in previous videos. But something you might not expect is that a lot of analysis of this visual novel don't really dig into what the story is actually conveying. Checklist critique can tell you that Ace Attorney has an excellent structure, it can tell you it's snappy, satisfying, the characters grow, there's stakes. In fact, that is what a lot of checklist reviews of Ace Attorney do.
Said that, you could look at Apollo Justice Ace Attorney itself as a piece of political messaging from the time, but I don't think that's a bad thing to begin with, and simultaneously I think this story holds up pretty strong on its merit alone, even if you have absolutely no idea about what I just said, because it all goes back to what I was saying earlier in the script, when I spoke about Apollo Justice doing a more serious interrogation of the entire legal system these games have than any of the previous ones ever set out to do.
Notice the move here. The political reading is noted, then set aside as optional. But is it optional? Or is a story about the law always making a political claim whether it intends to or not? Checklist criticism can help you identify patterns in stories, but it can't tell you what stories might be engaging with. Ace Attorney naturally being about the law is intensely political, yet it's kind of shocking that in his series, the YouTuber Jay's Reviews, who I hold in pretty high regard, does not at any moment talk about what the politics of Ace Attorney might be saying. As I talked about in my Ace Attorney video, specifically with Apollo Justice, the game clearly sets up questions about the nature of the law. Is law a human construct or objectively true? That's to say, positive law versus natural law. It sets up questions about if working within the system may not be enough, and it's very interesting. But in almost every video talking about Apollo Justice, I've never seen these things be brought up at all. What I'm hoping to point out here is that while the checklist method is serviceable, a method that is more useful for artists and that also goes a lot deeper is a dialectical materialist approach. I'm not the only one doing deeper analysis of stories on YouTube. While unrelated to Ace Attorney, a really good analysis I like is the video Super Paper Mario: How to Love When You're Going to Die, in which the creator Skyhoppers talks about not just what the story of Super Paper Mario is like, but what it says. But checklist criticism doesn't just appear in reviews. It's also the dominant mode of fandom critique, where it takes a specific form: lore obsession.
I don't expect there to be continuity between Zelda games in general, but if you're making a direct sequel, and one that takes place less than 10 years later, no less, there needs to be some effort to create cohesion in the narrative. Otherwise, why make it a direct sequel in the first place? This feels so careless in how it's set up, and without any plans for DLC, this is just how the story in this game is.
In their video about Tears of the Kingdom, I hate Tears of the Kingdom, the YouTuber Skilly Billy talks a lot about how the story of Tears of the Kingdom doesn't make any sense internally, as well as how it doesn't make sense comparing it to what Breath of the Wild established. However, I find this approach a bit lacking. Yes, it is important to point out that a story might not be internally consistent within a given series, but what I think is arguably more important is looking what the story is saying on its own merits. Ignore the fact for a second that Tears of the Kingdom says something about Breath of the Wild that is untrue, and ask yourself, if it were true, what would the story be saying through that? I'm not defending Tears of the Kingdom here, mind you. I'm pointing out that there's a clear limit in this type of critique. Because there could be more egregious problems or bigger things that are made well if the story is at least thematically coherent and is setting up something interesting, building up to it, and saying something. It could be an extremely racist story if you take it seriously enough, or maybe not, maybe it could be a very beautiful story if you go through the same process. But I hope that through this, I've helped shed some light on something. The checklist method is good for analyzing a game's structure, like Skilly does their entire video, but it's not good at analyzing what its story might be saying beyond that.
You're telling me that Zelda appears just as Rauru and Sonia are walking by? If Rauru and Sonia are Zelda's distant ancestors, like Sonia implies, where is their child? They're both dead by the time the memories wrap up, and we never hear about them having a kid, but their bloodline has to continue somehow, right? I wondered if maybe Minoru could have been Zelda's ancestor, but she's been hanging out in the Purapad the whole time, so that doesn't feel likely either. Why is Sonia the one with the time power? In Breath of the Wild, Zelda struggled to...
This also brings me to my next point, which is that while sure, a narrative's own consistency is something worth critiquing, focusing on that rather than what the story might be saying is using an inconsistency as an excuse to not do deeper analysis, and it's not good. In fact, many fandom spaces I've noticed, especially because of personal experience, have this expectation of what a given series needs to be like, and if it ever deviates from said expectation, the game itself is bad. Here, checklist criticism takes a different form, one where a fandom has any specific talking point that it uses constantly to measure new entries instead of looking at the broader piece. Does the new Zelda have dungeons like the old ones, yes or no? Does the new Sonic have momentum? As well as many other forms of surface level criticism. Remember the toolkit I mentioned at the beginning? This is hammering a nail with a screwdriver. Which brings me to my final thoughts. It's true, like Matthew Matosis said, that consuming a bunch of media is important for being a critic. But so is knowing your tools well. So is knowing critical theory and so many other things. This isn't me saying that you should apply critical theory to everything. I agree that even doing this to a game like Mario Kart, while you'd certainly come out with an interesting analysis, it would really be useful to anyone, because that game was not trying to say anything to begin with. But stories do try to say things. You can try to tell me that Sonic the Hedgehog doesn't say anything, but matter-of-factly, we agreed that it does before when they mentioned nature versus technology. I just looked beyond that. And it's not just about how we critique stories, it's about how we write them. It's cool if the story you're writing has a lot of hype moments and aura, but what is it saying? Have you ever thought about that? Perhaps you have an idea what you want to say, but you need to be able to say that effectively. And for that, you need these same tools used for dissecting and critiquing stories. You just have to use them for a different purpose. This is what I would like to end this video on. Checklist criticism is great at doing a lot of things, but it's not great at analyzing stories. Perhaps we should stop treating a screwdriver as if it were a hammer.